Welcome back. I am so thrilled you're joining me for this explainer because today we are tackling something absolutely huge. We're diving into one of the most high-stakes, deeply complex, and just intensely debated concepts in all of global geopolitics: humanitarian intervention. We're going to unpack the mechanics, the history, and the intense legal friction that happens when the immovable object of international law collides right into the unstoppable force of human morality. I mean, really think about it. When is war actually justified to save lives? Imagine a scenario where a state is unable, or worse, completely unwilling to defend its own citizens from severe persecution. What is the international community supposed to do? This is literally the ultimate moral paradox that global leaders face when mass atrocities happen. Do you respect a country's sovereign borders, or do you cross them with military force to save innocent lives? Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for unpacking this puzzle today. We'll start with the humanitarian paradox, trace the evolution of military intervention, and then look at the UN Charter contradiction. After that, we'll weigh lawful versus unlawful interventions, examine the critics and colonial claims, and wrap it all up with frameworks for the future. All right, Section 1, the humanitarian paradox. Let's establish the fundamental tension right off the bat, which is this clash between a state's sovereign borders and universal human rights. So to truly understand this, we need a precise foundation. Humanitarian intervention is the use, or even just the threat, of military force by a state across borders to stop severe human rights violations. Now, the absolute crux of this concept is that it happens without the host state's consent. That's a huge deal. It's what makes it so controversial, right? Because it's a direct override of a government's authority. And equally important here, the motive cannot be strategic. It can't be economic. It has to strictly be about protecting individuals. And you can see how these three characteristics perfectly illustrate the intense dialectic we're dealing with. You've got this undeniable moral necessity to protect human lives. That's the objective. But to actually achieve it, you have to use military force and actively infringe on another nation's sovereignty. The paradox exists precisely because we just lack clear, universally accepted legal rules that balance these three elements. Moving on to Section 2, the evolution of military intervention, because the struggle to balance these elements is definitely not a new phenomenon. Walking through this timeline really anchors these abstract ideas in reality. So back in the 17th century, philosopher Hugo Grotius first threw out the idea that no state has the right to just wantonly violate human rights. Fast forward to 1827, and we see this in practice during the Greek War of Independence, when Britain, France, and Russia intervened in the Battle of Navarino. But, and this is key, the justifications haven't always been purely altruistic. In 1859, John Stuart Mill actually justified intervention in places like India by claiming they basically lacked civilizational growth. Keep that in the back of your mind because it planted the exact seeds for the anti-colonial pushback we see today. Later, during the Cold War, the scope expanded to protect all people universally. But notice that final shift. After 9/11, global priorities heavily pivoted away from humanitarianism and straight into a war on terror. So the justifications for crossing borders act kind of like a chameleon, constantly changing with the eras. Which brings us to Section 3, the UN Charter contradiction. We need to talk about this massive friction point built right into the world's most important governing document. We are dealing with a literal legal gap here. On one hand, you have Article 2.4, which basically makes armed force unlawful. The original drafters wanted sovereign borders to be an absolute, inviolable brick wall. No threatening or using force against another state's territorial integrity, period. But then, flip over to Chapter 7. Suddenly, the Security Council is explicitly empowered to use collective security measures to maintain international peace. So you have this absolute right to territorial sovereignty on a direct, high-speed collision course with the UN's mandate to maintain peace. Now, if you're wondering how the courts interpret this mess, the Nicaragua case pretty much cements the strict legal reality. The International Court of Justice definitively concluded that using force to monitor human rights violates international law. Think about the gravity of that for a second. The highest court in the world essentially ruled that national sovereignty trumps human rights monitoring if it requires military force. For them, there's just no general right to intervention. The only legal workarounds are self-defense or getting direct authorization from the UN Security Council. So if the courts say there is no general right to intervene, what happens in the real world? Let's check out Section 4, lawful versus unlawful interventions. Post-World War II, genocide basically became the recognized gold standard for when to intervene. But consider this really grim logistical reality. Waiting for atrocities to formally meet that strict legal definition of genocide almost guarantees you're acting way too late to actually save people. This impossible timing issue forces states into a terrible choice. Do you wait around for legal UN approval while thousands die, or do you act outside the law to stop it? In practice, this creates a really stark divide. An intervention is technically only lawful if it secures Chapter 7 UN Security Council approval. Think about the 2011 intervention in Libya, or Operation Uphold Democracy in Haiti. But as we all know, the Security Council is notorious for political gridlock and vetoes. Because of that, states sometimes just launch unauthorized unilateral campaigns anyway. The protection of Kurds in northern Iraq after the Gulf War or the 1999 NATO bombing in Kosovo are prime examples. Were they ethically motivated? Perhaps. But strictly speaking, under international law, they were completely unlawful. Because these unauthorized interventions happen, there is fierce, completely valid opposition to this entire concept. Let's move to Section 5, Critics and Colonial Claims, and Steelman, the arguments from the other side. The crucial point for critics is that the label of humanitarianism is incredibly vulnerable to being weaponized. Just take a moment to consider this really chilling historical fact. When Adolf Hitler's forces occupied the Sudetenland, the justification he gave to the world was that he was merely attempting to quash ethnic tensions in Czechoslovakia. The language of humanitarianism was quite literally used as a smokescreen for blatant aggressive expansion. And, that dark history fuels some intense organized opposition today. Back in April 2000, the G77, which is a massive coalition of 133 developing nations, joined China in formally rejecting the so-called right to humanitarian intervention. They pointed out it simply has zero basis in the UN Charter. Remember John Stuart Mill's 19th century justifications? Well, these nations fear a return to that exact logic. They view intervention as a selective tool for powerful Western states to bypass international law under the guise of modern colonialism. Thinkers like Noam Chomsky hit the nail on the head when they point out that ulterior motives almost always drive interference. Plus, critics rightly note that jumping in unilaterally without a solid strategy often completely undermines the local citizens and just causes way more chaos. So, the debate is clearly polarized. Where on earth do we go from here? Let's move to our final section, Frameworks for the Future. Look, despite all that intense pushback, nations like the UK and Belgium actively support the legality of unauthorized interventions when the UN is gridlocked. And regardless of whether you personally view these actions as heroic or imperialistic, our sources point to one undeniable reality. This is going to persist in foreign policy. Because of that, scholars and policymakers argue that a sophisticated, rigorous new legal framework is just urgently required to stop the concept from being abused. To turn this murky, geopolitical gray area into a standardized, accountable practice, experts are proposing a rigorous 4-step framework. Step 1, mandatory Security Council authorization to prevent unilateral overreach. Step 2, a proven pure humanitarian motive to ensure absolutely no strategic gains, which directly answers the fears of the anti-colonial critics we just talked about. Step 3, military force has to be an absolute last resort after every single diplomatic avenue is exhausted. And Step 4, strict UN oversight on the ground to prevent chaos and ensure the intervening forces stay fully accountable. It's a rigorous framework designed to solve a nearly impossible problem, which leaves us with this final, deeply provocative question. How should the world balance the absolute sanctity of sovereign borders with the moral preservation of human life? There are absolutely no easy answers here, only really complex trade-offs. I highly urge you to keep exploring this incredible global puzzle, dig into the historical cases we discussed, and decide for yourself where that line should be drawn. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.